Barp. I am the president and CEO of United Way of Greenville County. And today I am joined by Tom Barkin. Tom is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, where he is responsible for monetary policy, bank supervision, payment services, and the Fed's national IT organization. He has held this position since 2018. Tom serves as a voting member in 2021 on the Fed's chief monetary policy body, the Federal Open Market Committee. He is on the ground continually in the Fed's 5th district, which covers South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, DC, and Maryland. His engagement in the region has brought real attention to areas facing economic challenges. Prior to joining the Richmond Fed, Tom was a senior partner and CFO at McKinsey & Company, a worldwide management consulting firm, where he oversaw McKinsey's offices in the Southern United States. He served on the board of directors of the Atlanta Fed from 2009 to 2014 and was the board's chairman from 2013 to 2014. Tom earned his bachelor's, MBA, and law degrees from Harvard University. Welcome, Tom. Thanks so much for joining us in Greenville, South Carolina.
Thanks, Megan. I'm enjoying the view here from the conference room just down the hall from you, where we're all being COVID safe. So thanks, everybody, for having me here. And I thought I might talk about the pandemic and the impact it's had on disparities in the economy. But first, before I do that, maybe I'll just spend a couple minutes talking about the economy, because most people are interested in that. I guess I'll just say it's been quite a year. Believe it or not, it's been 12 months since the entire economy shut down. And if we'd been here a year ago, equity markets would have dropped 30%, bond markets were in trouble, investment grade credits couldn't roll over the commercial paper. As a reminder, 700,000 people lost their jobs last March, and then 20 million more lost their jobs in April. Our economy a year ago was on the edge of a cliff, and no one knew it was on the other side. Now, fiscal policy, monetary policy came in with overwhelming force. From a Fed standpoint, we stepped up early. We took our policy rates to 0 in early March. We put a bunch of money from our balance sheet into the economy, purchasing $1.7 trillion of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities in March and April alone to try to bring those bond markets back. We also relaunched a number of Great Recession-era emergency lending facilities. Congress was decisive as well. There have been multiple fiscal packages that have supported those most at risk, also small businesses and certain industries in trouble. To put the magnitude into perspective, in 2009, we had a fiscal stimulus program. It was $900 billion. So far, we've put almost $6 trillion into this economy, so 6 times the size of that. And with that support, our economy's come most of the way back. GDP was down 2.5% in the fourth quarter versus a year ago. We're doing a lot better than places like Europe and most emerging markets. And the impact of policy on the economy is quite visible. Just a few examples. Normally in a downturn, disposable income goes down. People lose their jobs. In this downturn, disposable income's gone up. That's because of the enhanced unemployment and because of all these stimulus checks. Households have actually increased their savings, and that's true in every quartile of the income distribution. Households have paid down their credit cards. That's not usually what you see in a downturn. Banks have remained healthy. Of course, that's given all the support to individuals and businesses. The housing market has been incredibly strong. In part thanks to lower interest rates. People who've saved a lot of money but locked in their houses have shifted their spending from services, which are closed, to goods. And that's been really good for manufacturers. And of course, there are a lot of them here in the upstate. And those who are worse off have gotten stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment, loan forbearance. And all that has been just absolutely different than what you normally see in a downturn. Now, all that said, spending's come back faster than employment. We're still 9.5 million jobs down from where we were pre-pandemic. And until February, our losses were actually greater than they were in the very worst days of the Great Recession. We're still 6.2% down in terms of jobs. Now, all that said, I'm hopeful we're on the brink of completing the recovery here. Vaccines are rolling out. Case rates, hospitalizations, and deaths are all falling. If I can give you an analogy, think of the last time you were on a roller coaster. For me, it's been a while. Every roller coaster has a pause, right at the very end, just before the final plunge into the unknown. For our economy, winter was that pause. And the final stretch is going to be something because you've got excess savings, fiscal stimulus, warmer weather, pent-up demand, all funding a lot of consumers who are exhausted by isolation and freed by vaccines. So that's where I think we are on the economy. Now let me spend a second and talk about disparities and the impact of the pandemic. Like my prior comments, everything I'm going to say is my opinion only, not that of the Federal Reserve System. And that frees me up to take questions, which I'm really looking forward to at the end. So I'll talk about three topics. First, how the pandemic has changed the story. Second, how it's underlined and exacerbated parts of the story that haven't changed. And third, some initial ideas on where we might need to invest. So first, how's it changed the story? Well, we've been telling three stories for 20 years that I think are now different. The first is a trend that's called hollowing out. And that's basically the loss of middle income jobs and the growth at the high end and the growth at the low end. Now, the bad news is the high end's still growing. I mean, the good news is the high end's still growing. The bad news is this pandemic went straight after the low end of that barbell. The lowest wage jobs were down 37% between February and April, and they're still down 14% today, while the higher income jobs are actually up. So I'll argue it's not just about the middle income jobs anymore. We have to be thinking about these lower end personal contact service jobs. The second story we've been talking about for 20 years is the triumph of the bigger cities, right? Metro areas have seen higher population employment growth than non-metros, but this pandemic went right after dense urban areas, especially early on. They had earlier, longer shutdowns. And also, small town employment's more likely to be in essential industries like agriculture and food production and manufacturing. In the bigger cities, we're also now starting to see rising vacancy rates. People are relocating to less expensive cities, perhaps like Greenville, or buying houses outside the center city. And they're not being replaced by the typical influx of college students and young families. And so there's a new issue, which is all these employees that depend on downtown office workers. What's going to happen to them? Second change. The third story that's turned on its head, which is going to strike you as strange till I talk about it, is that usually recessions are worse on men, right? That's because in the prior three recessions, you've had men disproportionately represented in businesses like manufacturing and construction. Those are the ones that got hit the worst. But COVID's turned that on its head too. And this one has been much more of a women's recession, both in job loss and in labor force participation. That's partially industry mix, higher representation in restaurants and hospitality, but also the challenges of schools, the challenges of childcare, and the challenges of elder care. So three stories that have been turned on its head: middle income issue, male issue, and small town versus city issue. Then I want to talk about four places where it's just doubled down on problems we already had. The first is education. For decades, a college degree has been a dividing line. College graduates make more money, accumulate more wealth, and they have better health. But during the pandemic, it's also been the line between a job and no job. During the worst of it last spring, employment for people without a college degree fell almost 20%, compared to about 6% for people with a degree. And today, the unemployment rate for those with a BA is 3.8%. That's basically full employment. For those without a college degree, it's 7.2%, right? So that just gives you a sense of the disparities. And I think it's going to get worse. Why do I say that? Well, virtual learning is leaving students behind. You can totally see it in the data, particularly in math. And it may be worse than it seems because you've actually got students not going back to school at all and therefore not getting tested. Public school enrollment across our districts declining, especially in pre-K and K. And you can't get back the benefits of early education if you lose them. And so our economists back of the envelope this as a 3.8% decline in the share of children with a high school degree and 2.7% with a college degree. So that's huge losses in the future if you buy that math. At the same time, community college enrollment's down double digits, right? That's especially concerning because that's often the pathway back into the job market. So in short, I'm worried about losing a whole generation of students and what that means for them and our society as a whole. We've been doing a series of dialogues. They're on our website for those who are interested, with educators across our district. And I'll just say the stories are heartbreaking. So that's education. I also want to talk about connecting people to jobs, and I'll talk about two pieces to that. The first, of course, is broadband. And if you didn't think it was important now, if you can't learn online, if you can't work, remotely, if you can't buy things when stores are closed, you can't get access to healthcare, it becomes pretty damn clear. And it's still the case that as recently as last year, a third of households still had no strong broadband connection. And that's disproportionately in inner cities and small towns. Second issue has been underscored there is transportation. We know the less fortunate often don't have a reliable way to get to work, whether that's because public transit doesn't connect to the available jobs or they don't have access to a car. But of course, if car sharing and mass transit present health risks, all of a sudden you've just doubled down on this problem. And I hear in a lot of cities that declining ridership is leading many major transit agencies, both rail and also bus, to cut back their service, which is a real problem. Third thing I want to talk about is addiction. It's been a problem for years, but COVID's making it worse. Drug overdose deaths in the last year were the most ever recorded in a 12-month period. And you can imagine the isolation is extremely challenging. And people struggling with addiction have been cut off from family and friends and support networks and doctors. And I think, again, third place, this has made it worse. And then the fourth is the issue that underpins so many of these others, which is racial equity. The causes of inequity are numerous, and you can trace them back to throughout our country's painful history. But the effects are numerous as well. Higher unemployment, worse job losses during downturns, lower educational attainment, lower incomes, less wealth, poor health. And I do think these two have been exacerbated by this crisis. We know communities of color have been disproportionately affected by COVID. Blacks have died at almost 1.5 times the rate as whites. We see lower vaccination rates. In South Carolina, for example, as of March 1st, Blacks were 26% of the population, but only 15% of the vaccinations. And so if there was a health disparity to start, you got to imagine it's getting worse. And you also hear this on the education side. I hear from educators that virtual students are falling behind, and that in school districts where in-person is an option, it's primarily the white families are sending their kids back. There are likely issues of trust. There may well be concerns about infection in multi-generational households. And of course, these transportation issues I mentioned also affect minorities disproportionately. So if I talked about 3 different kinds of issues, 4 exacerbated, and all the work we have to do, where do people need to invest? And of course, this is a big issue for the United Way. I'll just say we have a crisis that's targeted the bottom end of the barbell. The people being hurt are young, they're women, they're people of color, and they're the least educated. They don't know if their jobs are coming back, and they don't know how they're going to pay the rent when eviction moratoriums finally end. Their health is threatened, and now their kids are at risk of being left behind too. So the first and obvious step is to get the virus under control, because pandemic damage is going to be a lot less in a world that's able to return to normal quickly versus one where people are still afraid to get into an elevator. So getting vaccines distributed, safely reopening the economy, those are clearly the first priority. We then need to talk about employment. And a lot of jobs are going to come back in the next 4 or 5 months if the economy reopens, as I think. But I think we've still got to work hard on participation and reallocation. What I mean by participation is targeted support for primary caregivers to return to work or to job retraining programs. That's support for childcare, elder care, safely reopening schools. We're seeing employers play an increasing role in this, whether it's on-site childcare, or I talked to a hospital in West Virginia that's offering a proctoring service for its employees' children. So at least they don't have to, leave work to help people do school, to help their kids do school. That's participation, but there's also reallocation. At the end of this, these personal contact service workers, there's not going to be as many jobs as there were at the beginning. And I think transition in new occupations, construction, manufacturing, healthcare are all occupations that are dying for people. States probably need to open up licensing, add instructors for occupations like nursing or commercial trucking. The funding from Pell Grants or state lotteries could be freed for community college certificate programs. And there is something about the whole life support that's needed to get back to a retraining program. I talked to a school in Northern Virginia that is used some of the CARES Act funding to fund wraparound services so that people who need and want to go back to community college can get access to housing, transportation, childcare, and the like. So second place is employment. We obviously have to invest further in education. We've got a bunch of students that need extra instruction and tutoring. Schools need the resources to safely teach in person so that parents will feel confident letting their kids come back. And I listened to a Northwestern professor talk on one of our district dialogues, and he made the very obvious point, which is, well, what are we doing this summer? Maybe we need to use summer to catch up. And if you think education is important, maybe now is the time to invest in it. On broadband, the crisis has made crystal clear that we need more investment. No one should have to do their schoolwork in the parking lot of McDonald's, as I heard tell in one small towns. And I think there will be more investment, but even before more investments made, our research team has noted that over $20 billion has been allocated for broadband by the federal government and not yet invested. And that's because the process is complicated and it's bureaucratic. And so I've been intrigued by the impact that I'm seeing in certain communities of investments in navigational support, people to help people navigate all the form filling that's needed to get the money allocated. Now, I've left equity for last. In part, it's the hardest, and in part because progress in education and employment and connectivity will impact equity as well. But I do want to point out just how valuable an equity lens can be. Take vaccines, for example, which we know is going to be critical here. A lot of communities have taken an equity perspective on vaccine, and when you do that, it reorients you to marketing to overcome lack of trust. It leads to a reexamination of distribution points to make sure you've got equal access. And it leads to models that make sure that price isn't a barrier. And I just say maybe that's a methodology that might be helpful in other settings. And I'm looking forward to learning a lot more about what you're doing in Greenville while I'm here. The Fed is doing its part to try to limit the increase in disparities as well. We've adopted a new long-run policy framework. We've heard from countless people who let us know that the least fortunate benefit from the historic strength of the labor market we saw in 2018 and 2019. So we've put forward a policy which hopes to support bringing more people in from the sidelines by maintaining accommodative policy as long as we can, as long as inflation stays moderated. To close, I just reiterate, we of course will see damage from this downturn as always, but we do have in our control the ability to limit the unique damage of this one, and I hope we will. Thanks, and Megan, I'm now open to any and all questions and challenges.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tom, for your thoughtful remarks. And we actually already have a question that's popped into Q&A. And for those of you on, please do pop your questions into Q&A and we'll get to those as well. Tom, the first one comes from Diane Smock, who her question is, one of my biggest concerns is the impact of the high wealth COVID refugees from large metro areas relocating to tertiary cities like Greenville and having an adverse effect on the affordability of housing for low and middle income people. We already have a critical need for more housing for income levels of 120% AMI and below, and these incoming buyers will only make the situation worse. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I think I actually have a different perspective on it. So I'll say it. I actually think Greenville will be a strong competitor for what was the phrase high wealth COVID refugees. And I think you ought to want high wealth COVID refugees. I think they pay taxes. I think they'll invest in the school systems. I think they'll build businesses and they'll spend money. So I think cities like Greenville ought to be interested in high wealth COVID refugees. But I think the issue you're raising on housing is a very good one. And I think that's got to be tackled directly. I wouldn't limit people moving here. I would invest in housing. And let me just spend a couple minutes on affordable housing because I hear it in a lot of parts of the district. You always have to think when you're talking about gentrification, affordable housing, about what problem you're trying to solve. One problem, which is very real, is people who are in their houses, increasingly surrounded by people buying nice houses in the neighborhood, and the tax rates going up. And so, especially with the elderly, people being forced out of their house. I just point out there are states that have figured out how to do this. In Florida, you only tax people, you only raise assessments when you sell the house. And so now the person who's in a house actually benefits because their valuation goes up. They don't pay more taxes and they only have to, and then they get more money when they sell. And so, if the issue is displacement, I think that is there's a tax policy way to handle displacement that can be done at the local level. I think the bigger issue tends to be access and affordability and availability. And it's just a math problem. I mean, you've got demand for housing, you've got limited supply, and whether it's developers or construction people, they're working on the more expensive houses. They make more money out of them. There's a lot of federal programs and local programs that support affordable housing, but probably not enough. And so what you've got to do is you've got to find a way to change the math. And you can change the math through land availability and donation. You can change the math by zoning. You can change the math by other development agreements that have people, construct affordable housing, as part of a development. But you actually got to change the math. And, and Charlotte is a good example right now where there's been a very aggressive philanthropic effort, corporations and the city and philanthropy to try to change the math so that you can subsidize, if you will, more affordable housing. I think that's got to be the key to it. And then I'll just say, Greenville's a great place. There is a lot of land here. So construction costs are high these days. That's an issue, but there is a lot of land. And I think that is an opportunity if you can find the way to, whether it's through zoning or otherwise, create, those opportunities to build it. But I don't think the winning answer is to prevent people with money from coming to town to hope that the low-cost housing will. I actually think it's convince them to come to town and then invest in helping make the math work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question coming in on a topic that we were chatting about before we got started today. In your opinion, how can nonprofits and governmental agencies cooperate to recapture those young children who have lost a critical early educational foundation? The Fed's Main Street and other loan opportunities have effectively supported businesses during the pandemic, but is there a chance that the Fed could direct its attention to social need investing in light of the critical needs you've discussed?
Well, I should start with what the Fed can do and what it can't do, which is we actually can't do loan programs. We have a few, on-the-shelf backstop programs to help markets not malfunction. But anything that looks like a lending program has to be authorized by Congress, as the Main Street lending facility was. And then when it's no longer authorized by Congress, as is the case today, we can't do it anymore. And so, the notion of credit is really a legislative task. We just don't have the authority for it. On the education stuff, I want to come back to summers. I really am intrigued with this idea. And, we all know that kids have been home from school and they haven't gotten the attention they otherwise would get. And if we're going to catch kids up, we kind of need to catch kids up. And I'm sure, massively unpopular locally, including with parents, but we probably ought to do it. And in Richmond, the superintendent has tried to get it done, and he's run into problems with his school board. And so now he's gotten a degree to do it next summer. But if you really believe that education matters, you really believe that, in-school learning matters, you really believe that you've got a population that's not learning the same way out of school, you got to get them into school and you got to get them taught. And I guess I just encourage, whatever thought has to happen. I don't think there's a substitute for education that's, funding it's education. And so I think we're going to have to try to make that time up as best we can. And I don't know how to do that other than utilize, and maybe this is the summer to do it. Maybe this is the summer to do it.
Yeah, I think it's a really valid point on sort of rethinking the education system and how we can best tap into the full potential of our kids and our families. So, Tom, at United Way, we've really been on the front lines of COVID-19 response efforts and now recovery efforts. And, of course, we're focused on, our low-income families, and predominantly we're seeing people of color and women disproportionately affected. You talked about that in your opening remarks. I'd be curious to get your feedback and your ideas on what you're seeing that works, making sure that we don't turn this into what you've referred to as long-term scarring for our communities, for our nation. What would you recommend, or what are you seeing that's making a big difference in the early sort of stages of this?
So one thing I'm really interested right now is there has been a massive amount of money legislatively allocated by the federal government toward fiscal stimulus, but really it's about fiscal support. And I'll call it's well-intentioned money. In the most recent legislation, there was $10 billion for broadband. In the most two recent legislations, there was $52 billion for tenant assistance and rental assistance. It's really well-intended money. I think it's actually really hard to get that money in the right hands. And I think there's really a role for folks problem solving how to get money in the right hands. So a few examples. Broadband. I mentioned earlier there's 20 billion, allocated, not yet funded. There's a lot of technical reasons for that. They use a map that if any one person in a census tract has broadband, they assume everybody has it. The forms are complicated. The navigation of the USDA, which is the agency, is a pain. But in West Virginia, the Benedum Foundation has actually started funding in various communities. I'll call them navigators, people to help communities navigate this process and get access to the money that's already been allocated. Rental assistance is another fascinating, one to me. I don't know if the numbers are right or not, but Philly Fed has done an analysis that suggests through, I think it was through March, they're estimating $11 billion in back rent. Well, the government just passed $52 billion in rental assistance. Now, I know from talking to people that money has not gotten through to all the people who need it. But boy, if we could actually help smooth the path there, that would be another game changer. Food insecurities, another good example. I think the number I saw is 80% of the people who are eligible for SNAP, get the money. Well, holy cow, you have 20% of the people in this country who are eligible for supplemental food benefits. They're not getting the money any other way. The definition of eligible is they don't have the money. So how can we help that last 20%, get the money? You see the same thing on kids who are seniors in high school, trying to get access to whether it's state lottery funding or Pell Grants, and the application process for that is big. So there's all these navigational stuff. And I'm starting to wonder, whether that's not, and I'm just an intensely practical human, so I'm sure there's more legislation that could be passed, but boy, this is a lot of money we need to get in the right hands. And so I'm just very interested in that. And of course, what local organizations like yours can do to help people navigate. In Garrett County, Maryland, there's an organization, it's kind of a leftover from a Lyndon Johnson Great Society sort of organization, but what they've decided to do is they're working on whole life support for people in need. And I asked them where they got the money, and they said, as a backdrop, this is Maryland, which funds more stuff statewide than South Carolina does, to be clear. But there's so much money in assistance out there from Maryland that just helping people navigate it is funding their whole operation. Just thought that was really interesting. These people can get access to the money, they're just not getting it.
Yeah, listen, I'm fascinated by this topic because I think there's a lot of well-intentioned people and well-intended money, to your point, that don't quite get to the people who need it most. And we learned that in 2019 because we had or 2020, because we had to pivot so quickly with COVID-19 around making sure that we were helping people literally keep food on the table, keep their lights on, pay their rent. So, as you think about this and you think about the most recent stimulus package, one of the benefits is it's real money going to middle class, low income families who need support. And that's a recommendation in the longer term strategies also, with many people agreeing that it could cut child poverty in half, which I think is one of the most powerful things we've seen in a long time. To me, that is that connectivity of getting the money to the right places and entrusting parents with the ability to make those choices. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that, of that more direct payment approach to our families.
Well, I hesitate to say this on the cut child poverty in half. I should probably just give you the math behind that analysis, because I read the research that was done. The case that's made is that all of the stuff this year will cut child poverty in half this year. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a 1-year child tax credit. It's a $1,400 stimulus check. It's the excess, it's the enhanced unemployment. All of the stuff that it talks about is stuff that is in this current package, but expires. And so I just want to, make sure people interpret the soundbite. It'll certainly help, those kids this year. Awesome. And I'm sure there'll be some knock-on effect for out years, but the math wouldn't support cutting child poverty in half in future years unless you did the stimulus package every year, which I don't think anyone's talking about. So, it's a challenge. I think we've done a lot of research in our shop on, benefits and the benefit structure. And, I'll note that there was a theory of the case in the 60s, which said, the way to eliminate poverty is to, give money to people. I'm exaggerating for effect. And by the time you got through the 70s, that was welfare. Welfare ended up with a very bad brand name. And so by the mid 90s, it was rebranded into workfare. And so the theory of the case was, give money to people who are looking for a job, but don't give money to the people who don't. And so you've got a set of funding for, I'll call it disability. You've got a funding for unemployment and other work-related benefits. You've got direct money in there for food, and other, things like that. But earned income tax credit. But I think, you can now look 20 years later and say, okay, that was an interesting and different angle. I don't think you can go back to the original angle. The original angle had issues with it. And I think there were legitimate concerns about its effectiveness. But, is this really driving more people to work? And what's being done for the people who theory would say 25 years later, well, we're not going to give them money if they're not going to look for a job. Well, now what's happened? Are they still, so I think it is a right for examination. I just think it's a real challenge this is a design challenge. It's just like the PPP. It was passed in a minute. It helped a ton of small businesses survive. And it helped a ton of small businesses that turned out didn't really need the money to survive. And I don't blame anybody, because how could you do it any better? I mean, the more you try to target, the harder it is to do it right. But if we were in a utopian world, we would design this thing right, with the right incentives, but also the right kind of support. And I'm sure there's a better model. It's just, I think, very hard to land the plane on it.
Yeah, fair point, right? And I think you're absolutely right on it being a design challenge that we have in so many regards. So, one of the things that you mentioned, of course, is the impact of COVID-19 on women. We have a question that popped up around that as well, in terms of women being disproportionately affected, in large part because of their caregiving responsibilities. We talked about children, of course, but aging parents and other family members fall into that category as well. It feels like a real warning related to how Gen X women in the workforce may soon be overwhelmed as their baby boomer parents need full-time care, but have little to no savings to pay for it. What thoughts do you have about how to support older adults with low resources who need care and whose children can't or don't want to provide that full-time care?
Well, there's a lot in that. So I'll just give a big picture, and then I'll target in. For our economy needs to continue to grow if we're going to have any chance of creating a better environment for our children, paying down the national debt, and all that kind of stuff. If you're going to grow the economy, you got to grow the workforce. And one huge benefit we've had in this country over the last 50 years is the ever increasing share of women in the workforce. Also, by the way, people 55 and up. I'll say, though, women in the workforce and their participation plateaued in about 99. And most people don't know that, but it dropped over the next 20 years before a little plug up in the last years of this upturn, and now a big drop today. And that drop is disproportionately working class women, right? It's actually, that drop is not with more well-off women. It's not with women 25 to 30. It's not a societal norm thing. It's 30 to 50 women with kids who don't make a lot of money. And this is back to the conversation we were having about affordable housing. What is it about that segment? And it's the same thing. The math doesn't work, right? The math doesn't work to send your kid to childcare and work because childcare is too expensive, right? The math doesn't work to spend whatever you have to spend on commute and whatever else. If you've got a mother in a nursing home, you might as well have your mother live with you. There's all this math that doesn't work. And so it's critically important, if we're going to grow the economy, that we grow participation. This crisis is, again, as I said at the beginning, pointed directly at women as opposed to prior crises. And I think it does point to support systems in our economy that don't quite work, right? And so childcare would be one that doesn't quite work. You can't by high quality, affordable childcare. Another version of this is pre-K. I mean, there's states out there, West Virginia, Georgia, Oklahoma, that have universal pre-K. And we know, we were talking about it earlier, Megan, but Fed's done a lot of research suggesting if you want to have kids get to a great start, they got to have, pre-K. A lot of the answer is already determined by the time they're 5. Mm-hmm. Mecklenburg County in Charlotte has just decided to make an investment to take pre-K up to 80% from its current, I think, 45%. So that's another place where you can get some leverage in getting folks into the workforce. We never thought nursing homes were a problem until this virus, but now, I mean, I have an 86-year-old mother who'll be glad that I'm telling you, I'm not dying to send her to a nursing home, given some of the health risks we saw. So there's a lot of support I think we need to really think about. And employers have a role here. One thing that's interesting to me is 20, 25 years ago, a lot of employers had daycare in their building. That's really gone away in most places. I'm told it's insurance issues, it's liability issues. Well, now wait a second. I mean, this ought to be a solvable problem. I mean, you have child, I don't know whether that is getting childcare installed in your thing run by a bonded third-party provider or doing something to take on the liability issues. But, if you want to bring women in the workforce, helping solve this problem is a real important thing. And I do want to say there are some positives to this pandemic. Remote work and flexible work. I can tell you at the Fed, we did not embrace flexible work when I arrived 3 years ago. We thought you had to be in the office every day. And so, there may be upsides to this. 2 career couples, one of them moves for a job, the other one can't get a job. That's a real thing in a lot of small towns. This may help with that. One of them could keep their old job and work remote. So I think there are some positives, but we're going to have to leverage them. And I think we have to leverage it with the right kind of support.
Yeah, I think that's spot on in terms of, again, going back to sort of design in a lot of regards, right, for our employers and for our communities on this front. Tom, I want to go back to education for just a moment. You've talked about the digital divide a bit in your remarks of education. Certainly the broadband issue, I would argue in a lot of cases is an economic issue of people not being able to afford, even if they do have access. Anecdotally, we heard a lot here through our On Track Greenville program that our high school students who should be in school if mom or dad or another adult in the home got laid off from their job, they were actually picking up 40-hour shifts at their job to help the family make ends meet. Sure. You on the idea of summer, what can we do to make sure that our low income students who were already facing these challenges pre-COVID-19, what can we do there to make sure that they have access and that they're getting keyed in? What are you seeing there?
I mean, I think this challenge of helping lower income kids through K-12 successfully is the highest degree of difficulty question there is out there, right? As I've worked with superintendents and seen them, it feels to me like it's a end-to-end process. It's got to be worked in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the parents, in terms of the funding. There are success stories. If you look at graduation rates or even success rates for 4th graders in Charlotte right now, and where that's gone in the last 5 or 10 years, I think you'd be impressed with that. So there are things that can be done, but I think the biggest challenge, honestly, is sustainability. If you describe it as I did, which is, you get the raw material in the kids when they're 3 or 4, and you want to take them through to, college graduates 20 years later. Well, how many superintendents stay for that period of time? How many school boards have that amount of patience? What set of parents have that amount of patience? I think there are folks out there who really do a good job on it, but it is a inch by inch kind of challenge that I think all of us just want solved in one fell swoop, and I just don't know how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's it, right? Is the sort of long-term opportunities that we have, knowing that it takes time to get there, but also staying on that progress as we go. I want to invite people, if you have any final questions, to put them in the Q&A. Tom, I will pose one to you before we wrap up. We are on every single top 10 list in the upstate of South Carolina nationally. Best place of fill in the blank. We're on that list. We love that. But we also know that we are faced with some very, very deep disparities, which keeps me up at night at United Way in terms of people who are struggling to make ends meet. So I'm really curious, as you think about sort of the impact of gentrification, which you talked a little bit about, the strain that we're seeing on infrastructure here in Greenville County and the upstate. My question is, how do we bring everyone along with us as we grow into this really mid-sized city that we're becoming?
Well, so a couple things you hit. One is, I really do think Greenville is a winning story in every conversation, but there's actually a cost of winning, right? And it's back to, I think it was Diane's first question around the refugees. But when you win, you end up with new problems. I lived in Atlanta for 30 years, right? Atlanta has a problem. It's called traffic, right? And that is an outcome of growth, and it's actually an outcome of unplanned growth, because you win, companies move to town, workers move to town, they want to get something affordable, they can't afford anything in town, so they build further and further out. Because they build further and further out, there's more and more and more traffic coming in, and that actually in the end hurts your overall story. So I'd say, this is not your question, but from an economic development standpoint, thinking hard about how to grow in a way that's sustainable is a big deal. And most big cities, and especially most southern big cities, actually fail at that. The second piece of this is keeping people, together. I live in Richmond now. I actually think Richmond's a great place. People in Richmond right now are depressed because Monument Avenue, which is a beautiful but tragically designed avenue, has now been the focus point of a set of issues that have unveiled racial tensions, which are obviously 150 years plus old. And so they don't feel they can come together as a city unless they put those things on the table and try to solve it. And so that's another set of issues. If you can't bring everyone along, and you could say that's economically, but I think it's also quality of opportunity, then I think you also have a problem as an engine. And then of course you're on the third point, which is, well, it's fine to have everyone feeling brought along, but I really want to support those people in the bottom. And so I think I just come back to a lot of stuff we've talked about. Pre-K is, if you don't get off to a good start, you're not going to make it work. The Fed has proven that in 100 different research papers. And you of course saw that in Minneapolis. And so anything you can do to get people off to a good start is great. You've then got to tackle the education system, the K-12. Again, it's the hardest problem in the world, but making progress on that and having parents feel that their kids have a shot, that's huge. I think this notion of ensuring people are well positioned when they get out, I think there's not enough time spent on the, I'll call it 18 to 20 era. We know college dropout rates are like 50%, right? And those people often have a lot of debt. So helping people find the right track, get in the right track, get trained into the right job, placed in the right place, and being mature enough, which they largely are at 21, which they largely aren't at 18, to be able to handle. I think that's another big thing. Obviously, not everyone's going to succeed. So then you want to, help those who are least fortunate. And I really do think, finding a way to get the wraparound help for those who are least well off, to put them in a position to succeed. And that's a combination of individualized attention, bringing in as best you can the money that is out there from various sources, and helping people into, food and a job and a roof over their head. I mean, it's all of that. Yeah, I'm sorry, there's not any silver bullet, but I think that is what communities are doing. That seems to be making it where it seems to make a difference.
Yeah, I keep going back to what you talked about with this navigator idea, right? There are so many critical points in one's life where I think a navigator could really help address some of those challenges. One more question that I have for you, Tom, and you touched on this, I think, in every single response that you had, which are the deep racial inequities that we're facing as a nation, and then on a sort of hyper local level. We started the Racial Equity and Economic Mobility Commission earlier this year. I know you know a little bit about it. You're going to learn more about it this afternoon. It was important to us as leaders through United Way, the Chamber, and also the Urban League, and so many other partners, that we, as much as possible, were proactive in looking at data in our community and actually doing something about it. We weren't interested in admiring the issues. We were saying, let's understand them and then also move forward so that we weren't a Minneapolis or a Ferguson or a Charlottesville that, we were inspired by a crisis point in our community. That doesn't mean that we don't have a deep long history with racial inequities in Greenville County by any stretch, and that's part of what we're looking at as well. What have you seen there? What gives you optimism or hope that you're seeing in your footprint that is starting to really make some progress when it comes to racial inequities?
Well, so first of all, I think most people take the topic seriously. And, I grew up in Tampa. I went to public schools there. The public schools in Tampa were desegregated in 1967 when I was in second grade. And I can tell you that the kids that arrived in my classroom, right, were not up to learning level, right? And I think that stayed with them forever and probably with their kids today. And so there are real things out there that drove the inequities we see today. And I think I'm impressed actually at how broadly that point is held. Now, what you do about it is very hard. And, I guess if public education is the hardest situation in the world, this one may be harder than that. But I find organizations doing what they can within their scope. So on the business side, I see a lot of organizations, I think you told me that's happening here, thinking about diversity and supplier base, right? Grow more businesses, help support more businesses, help make more people successful. I know there's a lot being done in terms of workforce development, community college programs tied with businesses to try to bring minorities in, partnerships with HBCUs, to try to bring more minorities, into the talent base. I definitely see that. And then I see some interesting stuff that I'd say is still on the come. I've talked about Charlotte a couple of times, not because I think of it any better than Greenville, but because that's where I'm going next. So I also was doing some reading about some of the stuff going on. They had a vibrant business entrepreneurship community, entrepreneurial street that was plowed under by the interstate back in the 50s. Well, rather than, admire the problem, they've sort of said, well, why wouldn't we invest in recreating that entrepreneurial district? And so there's a bunch of business people around trying to fund an minority entrepreneurial district in Charlotte with the name of and sort of co-located with this place that was, torn down 60 years, 50 years, 70 years ago. I think that's interesting. Asheville said, the single best thing we can do is education. So they've allocated a huge amount of money to take their public school system, which is majority Black, up a level. That's another thing you could do. I've talked about pre-K, that's another great example, just because disproportionately the people who are not in pre-K, happen to be minorities. I think this issue of health is interesting. In most southern cities, if you're on the wrong side of the street, your lifespan is 20 years shorter. That's strange. And, you can get into why that is, but it's a lot of stuff that actually is addressable. And so I think health is another place you're seeing people, particularly hospital systems, start to invest. And so again, I think good intent is core, and I see a lot of good intent. And then I see lots of experiments, and we'll see, what seems to get traction and what doesn't.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a firm believer that if any community can figure out our biggest social challenges, it is Greenville, South Carolina. So, Tom, thank you so much for joining us this morning for a really enriching conversation. Thank you for your comments. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll see you at our next CEO Connect. Thanks so much, Tom.
Thanks. I look forward to learning more while I'm here. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks.